Question for you. What are you doing on November 3rd? I want to personally invite you to join me, Nicole Jardim, Laura Bryden, and Jessica Drummond for an epic event, Hack Your Cycles to Change Your Life. This is an intimate one-day event in New York City focused on the menstrual cycle and why it's important for health. Virtual tickets are also available. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/New York for tickets and additional details. Again, that's fertilityfriday.com/New York. This episode is brought to you by my free 3-part video series, FAM 101. Discover how to chart your cycles by tracking the 3 main fertile signs: cervical mucus, basal body temperature, and cervical position, and ultimately develop body literacy by paying attention to your fertile signs. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM101 to grab your free copy. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 227. Welcome to the 227th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. So if you listened to last week's episode, you are already primed for this week's episode. So this is somewhat of a 2-part series. So in today's episode, we're talking about xenoestrogens, endocrine disrupting chemicals that, are in our care products. And we're talking about a specific study related to products geared to Black women. And, in the study, the researchers found that there were, a lot of ingredients that came out when they actually did brought the products, sent them for testing. They found that there were a lot of additional ingredients that weren't actually listed on the label, which just raises questions about the safety of these products and really kind of highlights some of the challenges just related to hair products. So, of course, these were products specifically geared to Black women, but it affects all women because pretty much all of the care products that we use contain a lot of different endocrine disrupting chemicals that, for the most part, we're not really aware of. And so in today's episode, we get into the science and the research around how these chemicals can impact our lives, our hormones, our bodies, our health, but also how they can potentially affect the health of our unborn children and how they can kind of affect the way that our children may grow up, their own sensitivity or likelihood of developing certain illnesses. So it's actually pretty terrifying, but it's really important that we are made aware of these things because then that allows us to make informed choices about the different products that we use, whether it's hair care products or beauty products or what have you. So really excited to share today's episode with you. And with that said, let's jump into today's episode. And I'm really excited to welcome my guest, Tiffany Katz, to the show. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'd love to start by just getting a little bit of background about how you fell into the work that you're doing. And I'm not sure if kind of endocrine disrupting hormones and xenoestrogens, I'm not sure if that's your main research focus, but what brought you to kind of focus on that area in some of the work that you do?
Sure. So my background is actually animal science, and I received my bachelor's in animal science and then went to get my Ph.D. at Rutgers University in the animal science department, which quickly, upon my arrival, changed its name to endocrinology in animal sciences. And so I very rapidly was in a new venue of hormones, the study of hormones and hormone action early on in my career. While I was there, and I'll probably end up coming back to this several times, my studies were really on the developmental exposure to toxins or toxicants and how that affects later in life risk. So what I specifically looked at during graduate school was exposure to alcohol. And so I found that alcohol exposure during pregnancy led the offspring to then develop more and worse mammary or breast tumors later in life. And so this was all in a rodent model, but there are a lot of studies in humans that look into this idea of what is now termed the developmental origins of disease, where exposures during early life, gestation, pubertal, neonatal, actually lead to diseases much later in life. And a lot of these studies are done with environmental estrogens because the developmental period is a very sensitive time for environmental estrogen exposure. So I hypothesized that the underlying mechanism for these kinds of phenomena were related to epigenetics. So epigenetics is the study of alterations that happen to DNA, not at the sequence level. So it's not a mutation or a deletion or something like that. It's actually a change of the proteins that are attached to the DNA. And so why I thought this was epigenetic alterations happen to DNA, but can lay dormant and not have any effects for a very, very prolonged period of time. So they're considered to be sustainable and persistent, but they're also very plastic. And so I did my postdoctoral research looking into the specifics of epigenetic alterations on both a molecular level and then later in a more whole animal or human environment level. And then I was actually interested in the protective effect of pregnancy against breast cancer. And so I did some studies looking at DNA methylation and how pregnancy alters the DNA methylation state of the DNA in the mammary gland or the breast, and how that affects your later life disease risk. So pregnancy also represents a period of great plasticity for the mother, in addition to the offspring. So as the mother's tissues are undergoing vast changes in architecture, structure, function, the DNA undergoes a lot of changes, and a lot of that is epigenetic because the functionality of epigenetic mechanisms are to poise DNA in certain states so that they're then prepared and ready for changes kind of off the cuff. So you become pregnant and your DNA is ready. All the DNA in the breast is like, okay, we're ready to do this function of creating milk and feeding children now. And so that's how the breast largely becomes developed to produce milk. And so then I started looking into this story of pregnancy, epigenetic alterations, and disease later in life. And so I wanted to continue that work, and I ended up here in Houston working on a very large consortium interested in the DOHAD hypothesis. And so we're testing various different toxicants during gestation and how that affects the offspring later in life, and particularly how it affects the epigenome.
Well, that is, I can see kind of how you fell down what I would call the rabbit hole because it's really fascinating. So kind of to put it in lay terms, I guess you could say, I mean, epigenetics in the most basic sense is the study of how the environment, so not necessarily outside, but the environment that this organism, this person is living in, how that impacts how their genes are expressed in the future. Is that right? Like how it can change, and what you're saying is it can cause changes on the DNA level that then can lay dormant, but later on can either turn on or off depending on what's happening in the environment.
Right. Yes. Epigenetics is the regulation of DNA. It is a method of regulating DNA.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's fascinating what you were talking about initially, which is that, what the mother is exposed to when the baby is forming, when she's pregnant, can then have effects later on in that child's life. And what's really fascinating to me, as a side note, is that yesterday I was reading this book. I was reading this book by T.S. Wiley called Sex, Lies, and Menopause. And in that book, she actually talks a lot about the link between like the protective effect of pregnancy that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. She talks about it with respect to hormones, because during pregnancy, a woman's, there's no other period in a woman's life where she would have that high level of her natural estrogens and progesterone. Right. And so in that, it's very fascinating to me that you were talking about that, because I literally was reading a book about it yesterday.
It's a really fascinating topic. It's been reproduced in a lot of animal models as well. So getting animals pregnant can have the same level of protection as just administering pregnancy level hormones to those animals. So it definitely is a hormonal function or a hormonal phenomena that makes the protective effect happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in her book, she talked about it as another stage of development. So we think of puberty as a stage of development, right? Like that's what leads us to adulthood. But what she was talking about in her book is that the concept that pregnancy is this additional stage of development that kind of matures women. And then, so I don't know if that's the case or not, but that's how she was framing it. And I thought it was a really interesting way to think about it.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with that statement, especially for things like the mammary gland and the uterus. Actually, if you imagine each tissue and its function, most tissues begin functioning once you're born, once you're ready to live. Your lungs start pumping, start breathing air, your heart is moving all the blood around, but your mammary glands and your uterus, they're just waiting, right? And so when it's time for them to function is when they now develop into their full maturity. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree that that's a whole nother stage of development for women.
Well, and although this isn't necessarily the topic we were planning to focus on, since we are clearly talking about it, could you share with us just a little bit of insight in terms of, like, I don't know if you have any statistics offhand or anything that might be asking, put you on the spot, but at the same time, share with us, for the audience members for whom this is like a new concept, how much of a protective effect can pregnancy have? And does that depend on the age of the woman when she does get pregnant? Maybe talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes, absolutely. So I know a little bit of statistics on this. It's actually the best way to afford yourself protection without an external modulation. So it's the highest way or the most effective method of protection against breast cancer. And so, it's modifiable, right? So you can get pregnant or you don't have to get pregnant. And it is very, very dependent on the age at which the mother becomes pregnant the first time. So a very young age at first pregnancy affords the greatest amount of protection. So if you become pregnant close to the age of 20, you're actually at a chance to have a reduced risk up to 50% of your lifetime risk. And so that's huge.
Wow. 50% reduction in your chance of getting breast cancer over the course of your entire life.
Exactly. And so, so that's huge. That percentage creeps up as the woman gets older. And so actually, as you approach 35, there's actually an inflection point. So all of this is compared to nulliparous or women who have never been pregnant. And once you get about the age of 35, then if you become pregnant for the first time around that age, you're about the same as a nulliparous woman in terms of risk for breast cancer. And then there will be an inverse association. So as you become pregnant later in life, so if you become pregnant closer to the age of 40, you will actually now begin to have an increase in your breast cancer risk.
And that's if you become pregnant at the age of 40 for the first time.
For the first time, correct.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah, and actually, if women become multiparous or have numerous pregnancies over their lifetime, that will further reduce their breast cancer risk.
Well, and does breastfeeding also play into that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's honestly very hard to tease out the studies. It's very well accepted that at least 2 years of breastfeeding, not per child, but over your entire life course, so 6 months for 4 children or a year for 2 children or something like that, will reduce your breast cancer risk. It's harder to study because the cohorts that are available to study this in don't often have all of the information that's required to formulate a good opinion or result. Mm-hmm. So either the numbers of women are low or just the surveys that they administered didn't include all of the information around pregnancy and lactation. Mm-hmm. So it is harder to do those studies, but larger cohorts are coming out now that hopefully will enable us to look more deeply into this question.
Mm-hmm. Well, taking it away from the science for a minute, as a woman so I've had 2 children, age 3 and 5 now, and going through pregnancy, it changes your body. Your breasts are forever different. They're forever different. They are never the same. So pregnancy changes your breasts, but then when you breastfeed your child, the actual act of breastfeeding changes your breasts forever. And so the concept, as a woman having gone through it, I feel like pregnancy did bring my body to another level of maturity, like another stage of development that puberty did not.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I also have 2 kids, a 2-year-old and a 4-month-old who I'm currently nursing. And yes, I completely agree that your body, actually, your breast, your uterus undergo these changes, but your brain also
yeah, totally does.
Epigenetic changes. And that can be linked to hormones as well, because a lot of what goes on in your reproductive functioning comes from your brain. Your brain is then stimulated to make hormones that tell the breast to make a hormone. So your brain actually does undergo changes as well. It's very interesting.
Well, yeah. And then on the emotional level, on the kind of more intangible, going through childbirth, however it happens, whether you deliver vaginally, whether you have a cesarean, either way, you have a positive, but kind of traumatic, like even if it's positive, right? Like your body literally goes through some sort of trauma. So I feel like even on an emotional side, there's stuff that goes on in terms of your maturation. You never come out of having a baby the same way. So anyways, we're kind of going down the rabbit hole here, but thank you for sharing that research with us. I think that it's if there was a drug that could reduce every woman's risk of cancer by 50%, it would be on every billboard and there'd be all kinds of news outlets talking about it. So why isn't this first, front page news? Why would you say that this is not really talked about?
There's a very good reason. And to be honest, this was my area of study for a while, and I left it because it's really hard to study. So if you were to propose giving young, healthy women a drug that you think will prevent their risk for breast cancer years and years and years into the future, that's a really difficult study to do. That's a really difficult study to get passed through any board, whether it's the FDA, the NIH, or anyone who you're going to work with to do a study like this. One, because young, healthy women, you don't want to mess with them, right? You don't want to give them anything that could end up being detrimental. You don't know. Additionally, you have to wait so long to get the result. And so you'll have no idea if this is working for them or not. And if it's not, then you're continuing to give it to them over a prolonged period of time. And it's so it really gets into the ethics of
Tiffany, what you're saying is so interesting, and I can't even help it. What you're saying is exactly what we are doing to women with the birth control pill, but that's a whole other topic.
I was feeling this was going to come up.
That's exactly what science did to women with the birth control pill. Anyways, well, and so I'm still in the rabbit hole, but the current public, I don't know if you would call it agenda, but the current feeling and thoughts around pregnancy for women are that young women should not be pregnant.
Right.
So we're in a social climate that does not encourage young pregnancy and does not support young mothers if they do fall pregnant, because the whole concept is you need to get your career in order, your life in order first, and then pregnancy is secondary to that. So this is kind of like a bigger thing, because it shows that our biology is very heavily mismatched to our social climate.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. I've been struggling with this recently, actually. As I mentioned, I have a 4-month-old, and okay. So for my previous life,
yeah.
I always thought I'd never be a statistic. I'll never allow motherhood to ruin my career. I'll never be one of those people. But now that I realize the true struggles, it's so unbelievably overwhelming, and it's really difficult not to fall into, and become a statistic, become a woman who, couldn't hack it, so to speak, having motherhood and a career and running your household and all this stuff. And so I completely agree that our society is not supportive of women, especially mothers, at any stage. I'd imagine it's even harder for young women.
Well, I was having this a similar conversation with my husband yesterday. And what I said to him was basically that, because I went through this as well, right? We're kind of in a similar stage, I would say, because our kids are kind of similar ages.
Yeah.
So I went through this. What you realize when you don't get it until you become a mother, I would say. So hopefully that doesn't sound rude, but I didn't. So I'll just speak for myself. I didn't get it until I became a mom. So when I became a mom, what I realized is that the world was not created for me.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I realized. So my career aspirations and my idea of what I thought my life would be like, it's based on the model, and the model was made for men.
Right.
So the concept of like working full time, and I mean, a lot of women do it, but it's a different conversation. And so, yeah, like this is a really complicated conversation, especially when you see the science, you see the research, and you see, wow, pregnancy at a young age. I mean, as soon as you look into fertility research, fertility and pregnancy becomes a lot more difficult for women when they become, when they get to their mid-30s, early 40s. Then we have this breast cancer risk thing, which is, it kind of correlates with when your fertility starts to drop off, which is very interesting. And you just realize that from a biological, physiological standpoint, the time we are supposed to be having kids is when we're going to university.
Yeah.
And then, and then if you choose to have kids at that, anyway, so this is like a big conversation, but I think it's super interesting when you're in the research and you see what it has to say, and then you kind of have to take it out of that context and think like, what does this mean for me as a woman? What does this mean for my daughters if I have girls? What does this mean for the world that we live in? It's really complicated.
Even science has been that way. So there's a very recent push towards including females in both rodent studies and human studies in
Imagine
your
that.
experiments. Because traditionally, people didn't want the complications of having to deal with an estrus or a menses cycle. And so they used traditionally men or male animals in all the studies. And so now we have all this data on men and not women. And so it's a horrible circumstance we live in.
Well, and what you said captures it. We didn't want the complication of an estrus cycle. So as women, we're kind of taught that our cycles are somehow separate. It's kind of like a feature, like an add-on. Like if you buy like a car, it's like this feature that's optional. That's how we're presented with this concept, except that the studies and the research show us that the menstrual cycle is integral.
Right.
Like if you get sick, the menstrual cycle stops, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's connected. So, I mean, that's the whole point of this podcast, to connect women with that concept that the menstrual cycle, it's not an add-on. This isn't an added feature. We're not men who bleed every now and then. Like we are completely different. Like we're completely different, beings.
I totally agree.
So let's switch gears a little bit, because I do want to talk a little bit. So when I reached out to you, I had been reading a study that you published along with some other researchers. And so the name of the study is Endocrine Disrupting Chemicals in Uterine Fibroids. Mm-hmm. So, as a Black woman who has fibroids, so I actually do have them. And the only reason I knew that I had them, I think I found out when I was like 24 or something. I was quite young. But I made the doctor essentially do an ultrasound on me because I knew I had a family history and whatever. So, we all, there's kind of like, as Black women, we're more likely to get fibroids. But even reading from your study here, it says uterine fibroids are the most frequent gynecological tumor, affecting 70 to 80% of women over their lifetime. So the vast majority of women then are getting fibroids. And although they're not cancerous, they often do cause various complications. So maybe just start us off telling us a little bit about fibroids, but also, I mean, you chose to do research in the area of like how endocrine disrupting chemicals are connected to it. So maybe just kind of start there, like tell us a little bit about the connection.
Sure. This gets back again to the developmental origins of health and disease hypothesis, or DOHAD. So my studies particularly look at the exposure of endocrine disrupting chemicals during early life and later risk for uterine fibroids. And to be clear, that study was actually a review. So while my lab has conducted these specific rodent studies, and we collaborate very closely with a lab who looks at human tissues as well, I did not conduct any of these studies myself. I just reviewed them and then wrote up what we call a review. But so as I mentioned, the time during development is it's very critical to kind of get everything right at that stage. And so when you're born, everything is there and in place and may seem perfectly fine. But as I mentioned, your epigenome may be altered in some way. And so what happens is the epigenome is altered and it's poised in a specific state. And then later in life, when you're exposed to something, and that something isn't necessarily something bad, it could just be puberty or pregnancy that you're exposed to. But now the genome reacts differently than it would have normally because its epigenome is poised to react in a different way than nature intended. And so what we found in the fibroid story is that exposures during development can lead to changes in the number of stem cells and how the stem cells then react. And so we found that there's an increased number of stem cells in animals who are exposed to environmental estrogens. And so actually our collaborator is doing some studies on looking at epigenetic alterations in human fibroid tissues. Now we just have been collaborating recently to get some of these studies done. So hopefully that work will be out soon. But so what happens is, so a stem cell is a cell that can become many different cells. So its differentiation state is very immature. I'll give a couple of examples, good examples of how stem cells work are in the skin and in the intestines. Both of those tissues, cells slough off the surface really easily and really frequently. And those cells that are sloughing off, it's a natural process. Your skin just, you exfoliate every so often. And in the intestinal tract, it's the same kind of thing. As food passes through, the cells slough off, and it's kind of like an exfoliation process. Those cells need to be replaced. So there are resident cells that are termed stem cells that can make new of different types of cells in the population that kind of move forward, eventually die, slough off, and the stem cells continue to regenerate, right? Mm-hmm. So other organs in the body that are less dynamic still have stem cells. Their role was very early during development to just make the tissue, and reproductive organs such as the breast or the uterus later on during later development, such as pregnancy and puberty, the stem cells will become active again to start regenerating or generating the new tissue that needs to now have a whole new function. And so increasing the number of these stem cells is an alteration in itself that's interesting, but also changing how these stem cells work. So the stem cell that's normally supposed to help the uterus expand and grow new populations of cells so that the expansion during pregnancy can occur, now are starting to make cells that then become a fibroid instead of during pregnancy when they're supposed to. It's doing this basally at any time. And so that's how we understand the process is occurring. And so how exactly the environmental estrogens are having the effect on the stem cell is not known, but hopefully we'll know soon. This is something that we are looking into as well.
That is really fascinating. It's fascinating. I've read a number of books that talk about fibroids in like a really kind of different, like emotional sense. It's often hard for me to especially when you suffer from a problem, like sometimes it's hard to read a book when someone's talking about it from an emotional standpoint, but I've heard people talk about it where it's like it's a metaphor for your creativity that's not being addressed, and instead of your uterus growing a baby, it's growing a fibroid. I've heard people say things like that. So what's really interesting is that the research that you were talking about with these endocrine disrupting chemicals potentially creating more stem cells or changing the function of these cells such that instead of growing the uterus normally during pregnancy, they're just growing these fibroids for what seems to be no reason. So interesting. That's a really fascinating insight.
Thanks. I agree.
Well, and so tell me a little bit then about, so this is from then from your research focusing on how this happens like at a developmental level. So does this mean that, for the women who are developing these fibroids, it's potentially kind of directly related to any type of exposure they had in utero or even as a young woman?
Absolutely, yeah. And so it can go both ways. So I'm not as aware, although I know that there exists, but I don't know enough about it to really go in depth into a lot of detail. But direct exposure, what I call direct, I tend to lump studies into direct exposures and developmental exposures. Direct exposure meaning adults who are exposed to chemicals in their environment or drugs or something like that, as opposed to developmental, where it's a little bit more of a passive exposure. So there are specific developmental windows related to different organs' development. And so there's kind of a timeline across gestation. And interestingly, in the fibroid study, we did find that exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals at the specific times when the uterus is undergoing changes are the times when they now will be predisposed to fibroids. So we did a study where we looked at 3 exposure windows, 2 during uterine development and 1 not during uterine development. And interestingly, the animals exposed during uterine development had an increase in their fibroid accumulation, whereas the animals who were exposed at a time where the uterus was not developing did not display this increase in disease risk. So it definitely is tied to the specific stage during development. And yes, I think that women who are experiencing fibroids now during adulthood, while you may wonder about the things that you're intaking now, the makeup you're using, the hair products you're using, the food out of cans and bottles and things like that, but it could actually just be something that happened a very long time ago before you had any say in what was going on. And your decisions now, while I'm sure they do have an effect, may not be really the ultimate source of the problem. And actually this, I think, is very true for breast cancer as well. And there was a recent report, I say recent, but it was a few years ago, talking about how we've put so much time and money into understanding breast cancer development and trying to eradicate this disease, but what we haven't looked as closely at is timing. And so we look at a lot of risk factors that you're undergoing during your life, but we haven't studied the environmental effects of during development and a lot of different diseases. So this is now a very popular field, and it's known to induce liver disease, and just a lot of different diseases can occur during that. The exposure, what directly influenced your risk didn't happen during your lifetime, so to speak, but your pre-birth lifetime is what may be even more important. Wow.
This is really, I'm just sitting here kind of taking it all in and thinking about the implications of it. And I'm reminded of something that you said kind of earlier in the call, because you mentioned that these types of early exposures, they may turn, like they may have this effect on the DNA. They may turn something on or change something. And as you said, to give you this predisposition, this increased risk. But then it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the problem.
Right.
Maybe talk to us a little bit about that.
That's very true. So understanding risk is kind of complicated, right? Because it doesn't mean that you're going to have a disease. It means that you're now at risk for that disease. And something that I'm also studying that I find very interesting is that there can be what I call a second challenge during your life that now you're going to, if you encounter that, you're going to even more likely have the disease. And so as I mentioned earlier, during development, your genome may be poised or altered in a way that it's kind of sitting there and it's ready to go if something happens. And so now when you're exposed to, like I said, even puberty or pregnancy can then turn these on. But things like Poor diet can also be considered a secondary challenge. Different types of drugs or medications can be considered a secondary challenge. And so the genome is sitting there poised and ready and at an increased risk. But if you don't encounter these secondary challenges, nothing may ever happen. And then you encounter things. So, in skin, maybe being exposed to the sun for too long or going in tanning beds. Now, all of a sudden, you're going to get melanoma, whereas before you may have had a predisposition, but nothing may have happened. So I believe in this idea of these secondary challenges that can then, it's like a double punch, and then you're at a much higher risk of getting a disease. And so this brings me to the point a little bit of mediating risk that I believe really strongly in. So understanding your family history and the history of kind of your people. So I know as a Hispanic woman that we're at an increased risk for diabetes. And so I try my best to mediate that at every point that I can. And it is possible that something I was exposed to in utero has made me now at higher risk, and I'm Hispanic. So that's a double whammy. And so maybe there are other things, but I as many things on the risk factor checklist, I try to make sure I'm not checking. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's an important thing for women to learn to do, to take the reins of their own health.
Well, and one of the topics part of the reason that I reached out to you and that I'm so interested in the topic of endocrine disrupting chemicals, estrogens, this is something I've spoken about on the podcast many times because, in my role as a fertility awareness educator, teaching women to chart their cycles, then what's interesting is if you were to chart, if you're working with a woman and you chart with her over several months, if she makes certain changes, sometimes you can actually see the changes in her charts. So there are a number of women who kind of jump on the getting rid of the xenochemical bandwagon, and they, look at their house, they look at their beauty products. And the hard part for women is that every single beauty product ever made for women in the grocery store, every single product is full of these chemicals. It's not, you actively have to search for alternative products. Yeah. If you're not actively searching for alternative products, all of the products in your house contain these chemicals. So this is something where as a woman, default is that you're exposed to a ton of this stuff all the time, unless you're actively doing something about it. So when these women then go and really, look at their products, their cleaning products, their beauty products, all the Glade plug-in, I shouldn't use names, but I just did, all the plugins, the air fresheners, blah, 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 all that stuff. When they start to move it, a lot of women notice that their periods all of a sudden aren't as painful or as heavy. They notice a change in their cycles. So I think this concept, because growing up, there was definitely this idea that you got your genes from your parents and that was it. Right. You got this cancer gene and then you were going to get cancer. That was kind of, I think maybe that was the 90s. I don't know. But there was definitely this idea of kind of, I forget that there's a word for it, like determinism, like genetic. I don't know. You probably know more than I do the name. But there was this idea that whatever genes you have, that's going to be what you're going to have. And now this field of epigenetics tells us that we have these dispositions based on our family and obviously based on our in utero exposure to different things. Yeah. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be the worst case scenario. I think that's really, really important.
Yes, absolutely. But also, I think that we live in a new world, to be honest, and the industrialization has greatly expanded from before. Like you said, when they said, well, you're just going to get your genes from your parents, that was on some level true. It wasn't true, but there were just a lot fewer things out there to be scared of, I think, then. Not that anyone should be scared. I shouldn't use that word. But I read a book that really stuck with me a long time ago called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, who's one of my heroes. And it's about this kind of start of when we began to pollute our environment with all of these chemicals that we're reaping the not benefits of currently. And so it's a really fascinating read if anyone wants to pick it up.
Yeah, no, this is really, so when I was reaching out to you, I also reached out to another woman, and I'll be airing these episodes together. And in that episode, we talked specifically about Black women and how they interact with their beauty care products.
I look forward to hearing that one.
Well, and I mean, the reason that this is with fibroids, we all know that Black women have a higher risk. And so my question then, and I'm not sure that there's an answer, who knows, but is it really genetics? As people say, like you're just genetically predisposed, or is it that Black women use a lot more chemicals? Like, I don't know. Is it both?
I think it's both. And it's not only fibroids, right? It's breast cancer is worse and younger in Black women, and there are other diseases as well. And of course, there are health disparities across other ethnicities. And so that implies that there is some genetic component, but I do absolutely believe that it's likely both.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was just so there's research that's been done and looking at the different chemicals within products specifically sold and manufactured for Black women. And in addition to the fact that these products have in lots of chemicals, what was interesting is when Tola was talking about how Black women use products. And as a Black woman, I've used products that way, but I didn't even think about it. So typically, if you're using a product, let's say on your hair, you use that product on your hair, maybe you wash your hair, whatever, move on with your life. But the way that Black women often use these products is we layer them. You might spray that thing in your hair every day. For like just the way that she talked about it made me realize that Black women interact with their products differently. The products that are manufactured for us are really high in all these like xenochemicals, endocrine disrupting chemicals, not to mention the like insanely toxic things that Black women, and myself included, because I straightened my hair for years when I was a teenager.
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah. So when you use those, like, it's highly toxic chemicals, corrosive to the point that this is what we talked about on the episode. Like a lot of women who are not Black may not realize that if you, like the stuff that Black women use to straighten their hair, like if you put it on your skin, it will give you a chemical burn.
And even remembering the smell, I mean, should have told us.
Horrible. Yeah.
It was awful.
Yeah. So there's part of me that like, so this whole fibroids connection to even seeing in your study how it is like we know it is connected to these chemicals. And I'm curious as to if your research has kind of led you into, so your research has focused quite a bit on the in utero exposure and how that can increase your likelihood of getting these illnesses later on in life. And then once you have the illness as a grown woman, so once you have fibroids, continued exposure to these chemicals doesn't make it better. Like my understanding of fibroids is that they grow they grow based on estrogen exposure.
Yeah, they're hormone responsive for sure in several models.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us a little bit about that aspect of uterine fibroids then, like how they respond to the current environment as well as like in addition to this predisposition aspect of it.
Yeah, and so I've been interested in health disparities since I was in grad school. And so then my focus was breast cancer, and African American women are known to have a very disparate risk in breast cancer. And even then, it was thought that things like hair products and skin oils and things like that were involved because they were highly endocrine disrupting. And so again, it could also be the second hit idea. So because of your genetics, you have a predisposition, and also epigenetics can be heritable as well. So so someone may have been exposed in utero and have these epigenetic alterations, and they can pass those down. And so this is newer to the field and is still quite disputed, but it has been shown that it's possible to pass these changes down. But also your genetics are part of your predisposition as well, not including your epigenetic patterns, but your genetics. And so if you're already predisposed, now taking the second hit of these hair products, makeup, different types of oils, now that second hit is going to affect African American women more than other women because they have a genetic disposition already. It's the idea of mitigating your risk again, understanding your background and learning not necessarily why. As a scientist, I try to never ask why, but how you're predisposed to certain kinds of diseases and how second hits, or I shouldn't say second hits because that term is very, very used in the cancer field for something very specific, but I'll say second challenge. So how a second challenge might then alter your risk again. And so even though your body is fully developed, it doesn't mean that you don't respond to these chemicals. There are some that you don't respond to as well anymore. So BPA is a big one that everyone kind of went crazy over, and it blew up for a long time, and now everything's BPA free. But it actually was shown to have a really low estrogenic effect. It binds the estrogen receptor at a really low affinity. And your liver, once developed, actually clears BPA pretty rapidly. So the effects on an adult are probably a lot less disease promoting than in a youth or a child. But there are many that we come in contact with that could be having a major effect on us. So the way estrogens, xenoestrogens, and phytoestrogens all work is by binding the estrogen receptor, which then has its effect on DNA and on cell function in many ways. And so just because we're fully developed doesn't mean we don't have estrogen receptors anymore, or receptors to other hormones that are in our environment. So yes, being exposed to hormones as an adult can still bind your hormone receptors and have an effect in your tissues.
Well, I think as you were describing it, I was thinking about, the changes that bring us from a baby to like a child, and a child to an adolescent, and an adolescent to an adult. The changes so in utero, the changes that determine whether you're going to be a male or a female, it's based on your exposure to hormones. Mm-hmm. So if you think, I'm just kind of thinking about it and processing it, but obviously hormones, they set the stage for our development. And so our bodies were never, we were never evolved to process all of these fake hormones. So right. All of these chemicals that are made, they are a similar structure to hormones. So our body thinks that they're hormones, but they're not. They're these like foreign alien molecules. They're not found in nature at all. And so then if you think about it from that aspect, well, if hormones have specific changes in the body, they cause our bodies to grow and change in certain ways, and they impact our brain, as we were talking about with pregnancy, in certain ways. So then it would make sense that if we're exposed to all these foreign alien hormones that are nothing like the hormones that we would naturally produce, they're going to have effects. And chances are they're not going to be positive effects, obviously.
Right. Just to clarify one thing, xenoestrogens are estrogens that are made or produced industrially, or I don't know the appropriate word, but humans make these. There are natural estrogens and natural chemicals that mimic our hormones, and for estrogen at least, these are called phytoestrogens. So things like soy or genistein looks a lot like estrogen and can act as an estrogen in our bodies. But then something like tamoxifen or fulvestrant are things that are made by drug companies, and those are called xenoestrogens. And so it's another layer of foreign because it's not even found in nature, right? Mm-hmm. And there are studies looking at how phytoestrogens affect women. And to be honest, to date, they're quite conflicting. For a long time, menopausal women were asked to stay away from phytoestrogens, so to not eat anything with soy or what else. There are a few foods with phytoestrogens. But then the story flipped, and it was thought to help the effects of menopause by kind of estrogenizing the environment. And then women were encouraged to eat estrogenic foods. To be honest, I don't know what the correct or the best course of action for menopausal women or for the intake of phytoestrogens. I have a lot of personal things that I do. So I don't wear makeup. I don't use much product. I don't go for mani pedis. Now, this isn't because I'm worried that about my exposure. Maybe subconsciously it is, but I like to think that mostly it's out of laziness. But subconsciously, I'm a little worried on some level about what is really going on. But I don't steer my diet away from estrogenic foods. I still like to eat soybeans. I still like to indulge in soy sauce and things like that. So yeah, it's hard to say what, because it's almost everything in our environment you're exposing yourself to. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and for the women who are listening to this episode and possibly who tuned in because maybe they have fibroids and they're concerned about the possible connection between fibroids and the chemicals, trying to figure out, how did this happen? Why did I develop these fibroids, or why haven't they gone away, or whatever the case is, and could it be connected to the chemicals that I'm exposed to? So, it's very complicated. I think that what you just said shows us how complicated it is, because it's definitely ubiquitous.
Yes.
So just based on your research and also your lived experience as a woman and as a mother now, what, if anything, would you suggest to the women who are listening? How do we mitigate our risk?
It's a really hard
We don't expect you to have all the answers, but just talk to us about, because you have a lot of experience. You've been researching in this area for a long time. You have a lot of insights that the average person, like most of us, are not avidly researching this area. So maybe what have you come to?
Yeah, I guess personally, I do try to mitigate my beauty product usage as much as I can. I try not to eat, to be honest, I don't eat canned foods. Cans are lined with parabens and, I'm sorry, not parabens. Parabens are in a lot of beauty products. But, phthalates. It starts with a P and the spelling is really hard. So I messed that word up. But yeah, I don't like to be exposed to phthalates, which are in a lot of canned foods. But unfortunately, it's also lining a lot of our pipes. So you're kind of getting it just in water that comes from pipes. What else? I don't really adjust my diet because I'm hopeful, and some studies have shown that anything that might be in your food you can cook off or you're washing off. And so I do believe a lot of that literature. So I don't buy organic or anything like that. I also believe that I'm trying not to stomp on any particular industry, so maybe I'll just stomp on them all. But I think that it's really difficult to have an organic farm that ends up actually being organic because of the same reason that our water is contaminated with a lot of things. There's so much runoff from other farms that can contaminate the organic farms. And so I have a hard time believing that organic is really organic. So I don't do things like buy organic stuff. I do try to feed my children whole foods that I cook well and wash well, as opposed to any processed food that could have something in it that I don't know about or I don't know what it does. I'm much less strict with myself, of course, as I'm sure we all are. But yeah, I think that's mostly it. That I'm speaking about what I do for myself. I'm trying not to sound like I'm making recommendations for the general population that anyone should or shouldn't do what I do, but that's what I do.
Well, what's coming across is a very balanced approach. Like, you haven't thrown your computer to the side and got crazy. And because I've definitely, I know there's a couple of, I did an interview. I always refer to this interview that I did with Katie Singer, and it's not about chemicals. She talked about exposure to Wi-Fi waves, like
Wow.
electromagnetic radiation, so EMR. So after that interview, you feel like running and hiding under a rock and throwing out your cell phone. But I mean, I'm not throwing out my cell phone.
No, I remember when I was pregnant both times, kind of thinking about not being too close to my cell phone.
Yeah. But you
But
still used it though. Like,
I
so, I mean, we still live in this world. I feel like the points you made are very sound. I mean, we still live in the world. And I've looked at some research that shows that, yeah, like when you're looking at organic meat and stuff, I mean, there are cars in this world, like hundreds of millions of them. And regardless of where we go, when we breathe air, we're inhaling toxins. So I understand that perspective. I mean, that's the whole thing about living in an ecosystem. Like if you pollute one part of it, the whole part is polluted. That's how this works.
Yeah.
And so that's why every single one of us has dioxins in our blood.
Yep.
Right? Like, but with that being said, I think that it's important for us to do what we can. And I think that the message that I like to share is a balanced one. There's never going to be a situation where we're all pristine and clean, exposed to zero toxins or anything like that, because this is the world that we live in. However, there's a lot we can do in our own homes. And I think that really the only thing that they can really ask somebody to do is to actually kind of open their eyes, look around their own house and see what is within their control. So it's within your control what types of products you buy, what types of things that you put on your skin, what types of things that you use within your home. And I feel like from what I've seen on the menstrual cycle chart and from what I've experienced personally, for women who do, a lot of women have challenges with painful periods. A lot of women have issues with their menstrual cycle. So in terms of, and I know you said, I know there's these phytoestrogens in soy, I still like eating soy every now and then. So my answer to all of that is always, well, look at what your menstrual cycle says. When you pay attention to your cycle, you'll know if you happen to be sensitive to soy. You'll know if you happen to be sensitive to certain types of chemicals, because if you track your cycles over the course of several months or years, and then you kind of play with it a little bit, like, okay, I'm not going to eat soy this month, and I'll add it in, or okay, I'm going to get rid of all the chemicals and see what happens to my cycles. You'll get the answer to the questions.
That's such an interesting indicator. I was just talking to someone about heart disease recently, and they were saying, they really don't eat red meat. They have rampant heart disease in their family, and we were talking about different things that they do or don't do, and now they're thinking they're going to start adding red meat back in. And I was trying to explain to them that it's so individualistic. And I'll give one story. When I was young, I had high cholesterol, and the doctor was really surprised because I'm very petite. I'm a little tiny person. He said, "Oh my God, you have the cholesterol of a 400-pound man, and I haven't seen anything like this." And he was telling me all the risk factors and all the things I can do. And it turned out that all the women in my family had high cholesterol. So I was trying to figure out how to mitigate my risk. And we would meet every 3 months and do blood tests. So I spent 3 months not eating any dairy. I spent 3 months not eating any meat. And I did a lot of different interventions, and I was my own control. And nothing seemed to work until I got to exercise. And at the time, I hated exercise. Now I love exercise. But I spent 3 months running for at least an hour on the treadmill, and my cholesterol levels were absolutely beautiful at that checkup. So it's very individualistic. For some people, diet is a major factor in how it affects their cholesterol. And for some people like myself, it wasn't. So it's hard to say who's going to respond to what.
Yes, I love that.
But we have some things that we can use to gauge what we're going to respond to.
Mm-hmm. That's such an important example. Because what works for one person doesn't work for another. Like what do they say? One man's something is another man's poison. I don't remember, but you get the point. Well, Tiffany, it's been just such a great opportunity to chat with you. Thank you so much for taking us through your research. And I really feel like you expanded our minds. I mean, just the concept of how early exposure can affect your child long term. I mean, it's kind of hard because I know there's some women who are listening who are pregnant or who are trying to get pregnant and will be pregnant at some point or have been pregnant. And so whenever, oh, sorry.
I just said there's so much pressure on women.
Yeah.
so much more. I just added additional pressure on you guys. Sorry.
Well, yeah. And I mean, that's why I like to just kind of talk about some of these things, because I know that there's some women who are thinking to themselves, like, I messed up my kid. And at the end of the day, like, it comes back to, first of all, we can all do what we can do. But learning this information gives us an opportunity to kind of think about it a little bit differently and make some different choices. And I think that's the point. So hopefully all the listeners can take something away from it. But what would you want to say to that woman who is pregnant or is thinking about getting pregnant or has been pregnant and is now a little bit concerned about exposing their unborn baby to xenochemicals?
Yeah, I would say that you cannot assign fault. It's almost impossible to be perfect, and you'll see this with motherhood as well. But yeah, absolutely don't assign fault to yourself. Being a woman in general it's a heavy burden to carry already, and we are under a lot of pressure. We're the mothers of the society, and we're supposed to be our caretakers, and we're supposed to be all these things, and we don't have to be. We can be any way we want, and you can think about your pregnancy that way as well. You can try and be as chemical-free and stress-free. I highly recommend trying to have as stress-free pregnancy as possible. I think that stress has almost as much of an impact as any of these chemicals we're talking about, or maybe even more of an impact. But yeah, I would say don't assign yourself any blame. Everyone is doing the best they can, and that's all you can do.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for being here. Where can the listeners go if they want to learn more about your research and basically just increase their awareness of how these chemicals it can impact us?
Yeah, that's a great question. I honestly find it a little bit difficult to gauge in the current environment where to go to get the best information, to be honest. I was doing some Google searches before our chat, and sometimes I find it, I don't necessarily know if I believe a certain website or not. So I wouldn't encourage just Googling and believing everything you read, but going to peer-reviewed, reputable journals.
Well, one of the things that we can do, so we talked about the review that you were part of, so we can certainly link to that. And then perhaps if you want to, you could send a few links to me to link as well, just on some of the papers that you have done research on. So at least the listeners of the podcast can go and take a look at the abstracts and learn a little bit from there.
Sure. I also wrote a really comprehensive review on the protective effect of pregnancy as well. So we can put that in the links too. Absolutely.
Well, I think that's a really great place to start. And your advice is sound. Google is a very interesting place.
You can find almost anything you want to find on there. So.
Absolutely. Every perspective is out there. So if you have one, you will find supporting information. Oh, well, thank you so much for being here, Tiffany. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and be with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/227. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode with Tiffany. It was just so informative, and it's like informative, terrifying, gratifying. You know, there's just a lot of different thoughts that were going through my head throughout the interview. And I think one of them is just, it's kind of jarring to think how the products that you use can have an impact on how your children can, you know, grow up, their likelihood of developing certain illnesses, their likelihood of developing, you know, especially for female children, you know, as we were talking about today, their likelihood of developing endometriosis or just, you know, different reproductive type issues, fibroids, things like that. It really just puts a lot of things into perspective. And as a woman, you know, I've said this on the podcast many times, but all of the products out there that are geared to women, the kind of standard fare, unless you're going out of your way to look for natural ingredients and things that don't contain chemicals and fragrance and, you know, all those endocrine disrupting compounds and all those types of things, unless you're going out of your way to avoid those, you know, all of the products that we buy, they contain them. And there's really little thought given to how these products are affecting our health today, let alone the effect of our, of our children. I think many women go through an interesting like house purge, when they get pregnant. So for those of you who are listening, whether you're, at some point thinking about getting pregnant in the future, or if you're pregnant right now, or if you're planning to get pregnant in the near future, it's really interesting what happens, because often, whether it's during pregnancy or after pregnancy when the baby arrives, often we do become aware of like, wow, I shouldn't be using this scented laundry detergent with my kids' clothes. And, I shouldn't be using lotion that has perfume just in case my baby has sensitive skin. And it's really interesting because you kind of go through this, like, it's like this mother bear instinct to protect your baby from all of this stuff. But then does it occur to you that, maybe I should be taking the same precautions with myself? I mean, maybe the things that I'm protecting my baby from, or my unborn baby from, maybe I should be protecting myself from those things. And why is it not okay for my, children to have access to be exposed to these things, but like, why is it okay for me, type of thing? So I feel like there's a lot of interesting things that happen. And it really, this interesting dichotomy, when you become a mom, to really think about putting, protecting your kids and keeping them safe, which I am not downplaying at all, because of course we want to do that. But at the same time, I mean, what about me? What about myself? If these chemicals can potentially cause issues for my children, could they cause issues for me? And, with rising rates of all kinds of different illnesses, diseases, it just makes you wonder. And it's really interesting when you look at the research. I mean, they know that these chemicals disrupt normal hormonal balance. So especially for women who are concerned, who, whether you're charting your cycles or not, but you have a sense that there's an issue with hormones happening, many women find that by getting rid of all of these, not all necessarily, but reducing their exposure to different products, stop buying things with fragrance, and just being a little bit more conscious, or a lot more conscious about the types of things that you use for cleaning, for beauty products, all the scented stuff, all those plugins. Every time I go to someone's house and they've got these plugins, I always think to myself, do they know how much chemicals are in those things? And so many women just find that just by reducing their exposure, it can really help. So yeah, I'm really happy just to be continuing this conversation. For those of you who've listened to the podcast for a while, you'll know that xenoestrogens and endocrine disrupting chemicals are a topic that comes up a lot. And, when you're charting the menstrual cycle and paying attention to your periods and paying attention to, all of the different parameters of your cycle, especially if you're having different challenges, it's really interesting because when every woman's different. So it's not to say that every woman's going to, reduce her product exposure and all of a sudden her cycles are going to be perfect. But many women do notice subtle improvements, whether it's specifically in their cycles and in their charts, or whether it's their symptoms. Maybe certain symptoms premenstrually go away a little bit, or even in terms of period pain or heaviness, and different aspects of their actual period can change. And so I think, like, the proof is in the pudding, so they say. If you're paying attention to your cycles and you start making these changes, you have the opportunity to see if it was affecting you. So I'm curious just to hear about your experiences. So join us in the Fertility Friday Facebook community. We'll be talking about this in there. So that's if you head over to fertilityfriday.com/community. When this episode airs, I'm going to post in there, and we're going to, talk about this, because I know that a lot of the women in the group have found themselves somewhere on this journey, whether they've already kind of gone and thrown a bunch of stuff out, or whether they're just kind of doing one thing at a time. I find that a lot of my clients, it's really overwhelming, and it's not necessarily advisable to just go and throw everything out at once. And it's also very expensive. So many of my clients find a pattern. So they kind of, as things run out, so, as you run out of your dishwashing liquid, you kind of, when you're ready to replace it, you look for an unscented version. Or same thing with laundry detergent or different cleaning supplies. When you run out of one, look for something that doesn't have a scent. And beauty products are often really challenging, especially if your, hair type is a little bit different, if you need certain types, to make it look pretty and all of that. But often with a little bit of experimentation, and especially connecting with other women who maybe have a similar hair type, or just have maybe gone through their own journey of replacing their products, that's really helpful to be able to share tips and products and companies and things like that really work to create products that don't contain a lot of these things, but also work I know I've had the experience many times where I'm trying to offer a natural cleaning product just to find that it doesn't work. It doesn't actually clean anything. And I mean, that defeats the point. So it's a bit of an adjustment. It takes a little bit of time. So, give yourself a good period of time if this is something that you're thinking about implementing yourself. But it does make a difference. It makes a really big difference. And it's just for overall health. Like, even if we take the menstrual cycle out of it, a lot of these chemicals are linked to a lot of serious illnesses and conditions. We know that they disrupt the endocrine system. Some of them are linked to cancers and different serious conditions. And many researchers are talking about toxins as the root for a lot of toxin exposure to the root of a lot of conditions, even conditions like PCOS and diabetes being linked to, like, we think, okay, it must be 100% related to sugar. But, a lot of researchers are uncovering the connection between a lot of these common modern day chronic illnesses to toxin exposure. So beyond the menstrual cycle, there are benefits for trying to find ways to minimize our exposure. So with that said, I just want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to the podcast, for supporting the show. I really appreciate all of you for spreading the word, sharing the episodes with your friends. This is how women are finding the show. And it's really how we're going to get out the word about fertility awareness, about body literacy, and just getting in control and charge of your health, learning what we can so that we can make informed decisions about everything from what type of birth control we're going to use to what types of hair products and skincare products that we're going to use. So with that said, I just want to thank you once again for listening today. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.